Awareness and Political Advocacy. He is currently chair of the advisory panel for the Center for Patient Safety and is a member of the Patient Safety Working Group for the Missouri Board of Pharmacy. Terry's research focuses on implementation science, a growing field within health services research, and he is presently working with the Dissemination and Inflammation Research Corps at Washington University while he was on sabbatical from STLCOP. So Terry will introduce you to your panelists and lead tonight's REMS discussion. So welcome, Terry.
This is a tremendous place. Am I right?
Yeah.
Glad you came. Thank you very much for participating in this discussion. We do hope that it's an open discussion that you do participate in. Obviously, we have prepared some questions for the panelists, but we're looking forward to some questions from the audience as well. Toward the end of the session, you'll notice that you've got a card at your seat, so you can jot down if anything comes up, a question. We'll go through those at the end of the session, so we'll kind of pick them up about halfway through. So if things trigger in your mind, or you had a preconceived idea of something, a burning question you wanted answered, then that's definitely the case. We do hope this is an enjoyable and relaxing evening. I think the setting is conducive to that. So just a few words of background, a little bit about REMS programs. That's the focus of today's topic. And this is this 4 years in a row for the Meeting of the Minds, or 5? Yeah. Something. So, this has really been a neat thing that the college has done, bringing in people who have expertise in areas and giving you a chance to get down in the details and the depth of the kinds of things for a specific topic. So today is really on REMS programs. And, in 2007, the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act was passed by Congress. And one of their amendments that they had brought on was the Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies, or REMS. And so this has been a big issue throughout healthcare now, especially through in pharmacy. And the purpose of the REMS programs was twofold, really to change that balance of benefit to risk ratio such that we can mitigate the risk and maybe even allow certain drugs that might not have been available to the market. But because there were programs that decreased the risk, then the thought was that they would be more likely to be available through the United States. Elements of REMS programs, there's several different components. It's really a suite of programs that are implemented for the REMS system. So medication guides are required in a lot of instances, and I know that you're familiar with these medication guides. But there are certification for health professionals that have taken place, both the prescribers and the pharmacies and pharmacists. Patient registries have developed because of this. Product use restrictions, documentation of safe use condition, patient monitoring programs have developed as part of REMS. Communication plans and dear prescriber letters, those kinds of things. And then there's elements to assure safe use, ETA, ASU. So those really are different components that are available for other REMS programs. Over the last 5 years, though, there's been concerns have been developed about REMS, mostly around two areas. One, ironically, it may be that REMS is decreasing accessibility of patients to certain drugs. And so that would be because of the restriction that is put on some of the drugs and the use. So FDA has taken some heat over that. The other has been on the burden to healthcare. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and focus on the burden, at least in the pharmacy areas as well. In response to these recent concerns, FDA has developed several programs to improve the implementation of REMS and the evaluation and assessment of them as well. In 2011, FDA created REMS Integration Initiative, and that is a new philosophy, I would say, that is developing guidance on how the statutory some of the statutory issues are raised and how they're followed through, how programs are developed. So they will be done more so with correspondence with the industry itself, with patients and consumer advocacy groups. And so FDA is really trying to enhance REMS. They're not going away, and so that's for certain. So that's a little bit of background for us today. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'll start here on my immediate right with Kevin James. Kevin currently serves as Vice President of Managed Markets for Avella Specialty Pharmacy. In this role, he's responsible for establishing and managing relationships with payers for specialty pharmacy services. James received his pharmacy degree from St. Louis College of Pharmacy and earned an MBA from Lindenwood University in St. Louis. He has more than 20 years of experience in managing pharmacy operations, program implementation, and managed care contracting for commercial and government programs. Prior to joining Avella, James served as the Director of Payer Contracting for Medicine Shop International. He's also worked for Walmart's pharmacy division as pharmacy manager, pharmacy district manager, and national account manager for government programs. So thank you, James, for being here. The second in our panel is Dean Erhardt. And Dean is principal with D2 Pharma Consulting, where he works with manufacturers in launching and reimbursement of pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device products across the specialty pharmacy, specialty distribution, retail, long-term care, and hospital markets, including limited and exclusive distribution models requiring REMS. In addition, Erhardt leads the D2 efforts in working with companies addressing managed care and government payer market access issues. Since launching D2 with his partner, Dan Stiver? Dan Stiver. D2 has worked with more than 90 companies launching multiple pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device products. Prior to becoming an industry consultant, Erhardt had positions with increasing responsibility with Express Scripts, Cardinal Health, and U.S. Healthcare. He earned his BA in marketing from the University of Oklahoma and MBA from the Keller Graduate School of Management. Next is Leah LaRue. Since graduating from St. Louis College of Pharmacy, Leah LaRue has held positions in increasing responsibility at Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals, including roles in medical information and patient and product safety, where she supported risk evaluation and mitigation strategies for Mallinckrodt products. LaRue most recently led the development of the medical advocacy department and is responsible for developing and implementing a portfolio-wide alliance strategy, serving as key contact in building and maintaining external relationships and executing safe use initiatives. Thank you for coming back. Michael Schultz is a graduate of St. Louis College of Pharmacy. He received a graduate degree in pharmacoeconomics from the University of Colorado, my alma mater, so go Buffs. Schultz is the co-founder and CFO of Foundation Care, a specialty pharmacy dedicated to pediatric patients with chronic orphan respiratory diseases such as cystic fibrosis. He is also the Vice President and Managing Partner for VCG and Associates Incorporated, a consulting company focusing on assisting startup and orphan drug pharmaceutical companies with commercial development. In 2008, he founded Latona Life Sciences and today serves as its Vice President of Business and Development of Orphan Drug Development Company focusing on orphan autoimmune diseases. Schultz is partner of Precise RX, a data analytics company that focuses on pharmaceutical contract audits and transactions. He's also owner of, I found this to be interesting, Schultz House Vineyards in Augusta, Missouri. Schultz's past work experiences include Express Scripts, Fujisawa Pharmaceuticals, Serrano Pharmaceuticals, Merck Sharp & Dohme, and Schnucks Pharmacies. So join me in welcoming these panelists today. So, on to the discussion portion of this, which is what I know you actually came here for. What I'd like for each of the panelists to do first is to tell us a little bit about your roles and experience with REMS programs. So we know that you're involved from your perspectives, but kind of what kinds of specific programs have you been involved in over the years? And maybe we'll start on the end.
With me, okay.
You bet.
Well, welcome everyone. And actually, my experience with REMS, the vast majority of my experience started with Express Scripts. When I was with the Express Scripts, working with the as the senior director of marketing there for the payer and for the pharmaceutical companies. And we had a number of products that actually at SDS, and just for Dean and I actually worked at the same time at Express Scripts there. So he can elaborate further on some of the individual programs. But we did a couple of things that were very innovative at the time. My group was asked by actually the federal government to evaluate a program at the time that wasn't exactly a REMS program. It was like a precursor to the REMS program. That was the Accutane program. And we were asked to utilize the Express Scripts database and Jim Clement, and I don't know if anybody here knows Jim Clement, actually analyzed the data, did surveys to individual pharmacies to find out if the actual program that was around Accutane, where you had to, validate the pharmacy value, make sure that patients had, a pregnancy test, all those kind of things, was actually working, and it was something that should be, either enhanced or whatever. And we did a very intricate study on that and presented it to the FDA. And of course, that just led to a number of other changes going forward with, this was back in 2002, 2003. And then actually in the specialty pharmacy, we on my side, I was working with Orphan Medical, while I was working with Orphan Medical corporate, Dean was working with Orphan Medical individually at specialty pharmacy with the launch of Xyrem. Those of you that know what Xyrem is here, there we go. The date rate drug, that was, so when something's called a date rate drug, generally there's some kind of management around it. And, and I think at the time, it was the tightest distribution system established in the United States for any pharmaceutical product at the time. Obviously, they didn't want that drug to get into the general population or whatever. So, and then from there, my experience with REMS is, just recently we launched a pharmaceutical company in San Diego by the name of Corcept with a product called Korlym. And that was an example of, and if anybody knows what Korlym is, it's RU46. It's the old, it's a drug that can be used also for, to abort pregnancies and something like that. Right, morning after pill. So what we did is work with them to create a distribution program that actually eliminated the need for the REMS program because what's the brand name for RU46 for the Avella? Anyway, any pharmacists here, they can remember that. Anyway, that has a REMS program, but Korlym, the same product, does not have a REMS program. It has a very tight distribution system that actually eliminates the need for that. And then also we worked with a company out of Scotland called Prostercon and launched a program for Abstral, which Abstral is a fentanyl product, a transdermal patch, and that was to fit into not their own REMS program, but an existing program. The FDA has different types of programs where they're aggregate for a drug classification, and it fit into the opioid classification, so it kind of dropped into an existing program or programs that were similar. So that's kind of my recent stuff. So that's it.
And Leah?
All right, so as you mentioned, Abstral and the opioid space, that's primarily where my experience comes from. I work for Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals, and everyone knows Mallinckrodt for the opioids and the pain space. So we have both branded and generic products, and I was a manager in the patient and product safety group. And as part of that, I worked on the REMS programs for our opioids. So we had 5 ANDAs as well as 2 NDAs that were part of the extended release and long-acting opioid REMS. And then we also had a generic active product that was part of the TERF, which stands for transmucosal immediate release fentanyl REMS. So I was involved in both of those, more heavily involved in the ERLA opioid REMS. I was the Mallinckrodt representative on the industry working group, which was also a company known as the REMS Program Company Group, where we were one of almost 20 member companies that were tasked by the FDA to create a REMS program for the ERLA opioid class, which was really a big challenge getting those companies into one room and to agree on one thing was very difficult because we had a combination of brands, generics, everybody had different interests. And so to come up with one document and then to carry out that document has been somewhat of a challenge. So I've been involved in that side, representing Mallinckrodt on that, and then also working internally with our regulatory affairs group to make sure that all of the documents were submitted on time, all of the assessments were complete and within compliance. So that's primarily my experience with RIMS.
All right, so I've worked on a variety of RIMS programs. I've also written a white paper that we can make available online on risk mitigation strategies and RIMS programs. But as Mike indicated on the JAZZ program, so the technical indication for the Xylem product is narcolepsy with apoplexy, right? So it means you take it to go to sleep, but you have to wake up every 4 hours to take the drug, which is kind of an interesting aspect. But it was the first time, at least to my knowledge, that the company actually went out and really negotiated with the FDA in terms of what the distribution programs would look like. And we actually had to set up, literally, a jail, for lack of a better description, in the warehouse where the product was located and had 24-hour armed guards in that product. So it was a very unique distribution model because it was completely controlled from one location, which was not that common, 12 years ago when we set that up. That has become more common in terms of exclusive distribution programs. But in addition, we had to track where that product went, to which patient, which physicians designated that product or wrote that product. All of those things that today under a RIMS program are called attestations under ETASU, or the elements to assure safe use. So really it was the precursor to much of what has become adopted for many of the really high focal points around the risk programs. So in addition, you can take a look at what's required for the data elements. We've set up a variety of RIMS programs, the worst of which I've seen is requiring from the FDA, requiring 60 different data elements. So in that particular perspective, there's data elements from the physician, data elements from the patient that have to be required to be provided before that, because the patient can actually prescribe that drug. And then once that drug is prescribed, that patient has to be tracked for the lifetime of their exposure to that product. So it becomes very interesting.
Very good. So my experience is a little bit different. It was kind of twofold. I first heard the term RIMS when I came to work for this Avella Specialty Pharmacy back in the end of '09. One of the first tasks that I got was to go to an ECRM conference in Atlanta, Georgia, where Dean's company, D2, was presenting RIMS and this new program, what it was going to mean to pharmacy, and try to help figure out with our clinical department what that meant to us and how we were going to manage that in the pharmacy space. So I was working with the clinical department. We do, our largest segment of our business is oral oncology. Many of those drugs are limited distribution, and many of them have RIMS programs associated with them. So working with our clinical department to make sure we have appropriate reporting in place, we can follow through and have just really a protocol for how to handle drugs that have a RIMS requirement. Further back in my career, I guess my hands-on experience was more along the lines of in the dispensing role back in the day, pre-RIMS, with risk map programs and dispensing drugs like Clozaril and Accutane, which at the time, we didn't know them as RIMS, but we knew that they had some special requirements that we had to follow in order to dispense. And that's really kind of where the evolution of RIMS got its start. And as we continue to have drugs in the marketplace that do have very serious potential adverse effects, and we'll continue to see more of this, and it'll impact more of you. And one thing I am curious about is just by maybe raise of hands, how many people in the room have worked with RIMS programs and have some knowledge of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So that's how I would suspect quite a few.
Very good. Thank you. As you can tell, we have a wealth of knowledge here, and we'll just jump right into the question. So again, because we might have a broad range of experience with RIMS, can you share, anyone just jump in, you can take over the question if you'd like, but can you share how RIMS are currently developed? What is the process that FDA uses with manufacturers? What is the negotiation, and how does it come out that this drug requires RIMS?
Well, let me start because I know Dean will jump in. And my company, BCG and Associates, was acquired 2 years ago by Quintiles. Quintiles is the largest contract research organization in the U.S. And when you ask about where does REMS come from, I can tell you, I used to deal with REMS when the products were close to being launched and everybody's scrambling around to develop a program to identify where it's going to go, where you're going to put it, who's going to take it, who you have to communicate to, what kind of education. But I got to tell you, in the last 2 years, from what I've learned from working with the bigger organization, Quintiles, is that all this stuff is going on now in late phase 2 and early phase 3. They're developing strategies and looking at where the products are going to fall, what the FDA might require as to long-term studies. They're also looking at REMS programs, interesting enough, as a competitive advantage versus some of their competitors. So they're looking at positioning REMS in a whole array of different venues to be able to take advantage. Where in the past, everybody was, when REMS first became in vogue with the FDA, it was like a bad thing. You know, you had to do stuff that was out of the ordinary. It was going to limit distribution. It was going to do all this. But it's sort of come full circle now, where pharmaceutical companies are getting sophisticated enough to look at how REMS are being rolled out and say, I could use this as a competitive advantage, either to keep my competitors away from me, to hide my data, or to do things like that. So we in BCG and Quintiles are starting the REMS process 2 years plus, at least before launch of the product.
Yeah, so I can jump in there also, just to simply answer your question. It's the manufacturers and the drug sponsors that develop the REMS over time, and sometimes they will do that with the help of, like you said, some various consultants who have had some experience with that in the past. So it's really the drug sponsors that develop this document, and sometimes it can grow to be a pretty large document and incorporate a different number of the REMS elements that Terry mentioned in the beginning. It can be as simple as a mitigation guide, or it can have all 5 components of a REMS and include a registry program. So it starts with the manufacturer. They draft an outline of what they think it should look like based on the known risks of the drug. Like you mentioned, it does start very early in the process, looking at phase 2 at least. And so at that point, you're looking at the side effects, what's happening in the safety profile of the drug, and where you might have some issues. And then based on that, you can look at other drugs in the same class to see if those drugs may have a REMS. You can maybe model it after that, or you may be forced to join a class-wide REMS program. And then from there, it's really a negotiation between the manufacturer and the FDA. So you show them what you're thinking, they come back and they say, okay, you know, we think you may have gone too far with this, you can step back a little bit, or maybe you weren't rigorous enough. So it's really a negotiation between the manufacturers and the FDA, and then usually it's approved as part of the final label. And it, in my mind, is almost like a contract between the manufacturer and the FDA, spelling out exactly what you're going to do within a certain period of time. You're going to send this number of letters, you're going to do this number of outreaches, and then you measure that over time and you follow up at least a minimum of 18 months, 3 years, and 7 years after approval. Although some manufacturers, like us, we do it every 6 months. We follow up with the FDA and just let them know what's going on with the program, what we're seeing. You can also request changes over time, so what's initially approved is not necessarily what you're stuck with. I mean, you can always change it over time based on what the data shows. Some products will, over time, no longer have a REMS based on the safety profile. So, I mean, it's really just a working document over time that changes based on the information you get back.
Yeah, I would say the evolution that we've seen the most of is definitely the timeline. So when REMS certainly, kind of started the process, it was not uncommon for us to work with a manufacturer who would come back and say, well, the FDA has indicated they might require a REMS. And we would say, okay, so what are we doing about that? And they would say, nothing. We're just waiting to find out, right? Well, waiting to find out from the FDA, let me just tell you, is never a good strategy. So one of the things that manufacturers have clearly gotten smarter about is the fact that they need to be proactive about what the REMS looks like. They need to be proactive relative to how that impacts their distribution channel. So is it going to restrict your ability to distribute via traditional retail? Are you going to have to look for specialty pharmacies? Are you going to have data that you're contracting for and getting from those pharmacies? I can tell you, we worked with a manufacturer, which was a top 10 manufacturer about 3 years ago on a product that they launched. And they were able to not only have a required RIMS program by going to the FDA and saying, here's the data we're going to collect, they were also able to eliminate a black box warning on that product by promising to the FDA that they were going to provide them data on a quarterly basis. Now, what was just indicated with the 18, 3, and 7 are the requirements around RIMS, right? 18 months, 3 years, and 7 years are the requirements for you to submit to the FDA. However, don't confuse yourself. The FDA has the ability to come in and require data at any point in time in between. So should they choose somewhere between that 18-month, 3-year period, that they want to know that you're being compliant and you don't have records that would indicate that, you're going to have a lot of problems with the FDA.
And to be honest, there's a whole bucket of manufacturers that in February of 2013, the FDA submitted a report on their follow-up to REMS programs. Since 2008, there's been 199 REMS programs. They surveyed 49 companies out of that were still active, because there's only like 90 plus active REMS programs. All the rest, like Leah said, it dropped off because they met the requirements. But of the active ones, only 9 met the requirements that they were asked to do when they submitted their REMS program. So we think, and we understand through our consultants at Quintiles, that there's going to be a significant effort by the FDA to lean on the manufacturers that do have active REMS programs to start delivering on the studies and the information and the data they required in their negotiations with the FDA.
Yeah, this is true. I would just add briefly, we've been audited twice since I've worked at Mallinckrodt, where the FDA calls you and says, we'll be there today or we'll be there tomorrow, and we want to go through all of your documents. So you have to be ready.
So those are just spontaneous audits.
Spontaneous.
I think it's interesting that the FDA was given the authority to require REMS in 2007, the FDA amended that. And so I guess from my perspective for a while, it was kind of like manufacturers would be sitting around waiting for the FDA to come in and say, okay, you've got to have it. They're looking at things like, what's the risk-benefit equation for your drug and how many people are going to be treated. And as opposed to sitting back, and you guys have said it here, it's more and more common, I think, for the manufacturers to actually start the process of developing REMS early on and be able to say to the FDA, hey, we have this program in place. Maybe I've got a narrow indication for my drug, and maybe there are some potential adverse effects, but I've got a REMS already in place, and maybe that helps me get the drug in the marketplace sooner than I might otherwise.
Well, keep in mind that originally when they came out with REMS, it was in reaction to some bad things that had happened in the market with certain products. But their concept was, if we can create a safety program and ensure safety for patients, then we can approve products that perhaps we couldn't approve without those safety measures.
And actually, I'm going to make a plug here for Dean Erhardt. Dean's company, D2, put together a white paper on REMS programs that's excellent. It's about 12, 13 pages of good stuff. It's only 20 pages long, but there's only 12 pages. But it's a very good background on what REMS programs are, and if you wouldn't mind making that available to
No, that's fine.
it's a very good piece of information for everybody to look to read and understand.
We have people that like to write, and I'm not one of them. I just get it.
That's really great, and I think that would be a valuable thing to have access to. So, thinking about, and this isn't one of the prepared questions, but that's really the joy of getting to be moderators. You can ask questions. But in your opinion, what has the existence of REM programs done to either facilitate or impair innovation in pharmaceutical manufacturers? Is it curtailing development of drugs, or is it actually helping?
I think it's difficult to say that it would impair innovation, because anytime you have requirements that are difficult, it's like a little kid asking for a cookie, right? They figure out a way to get to the result they want to get to, whether you like it or not. So certainly it has arguably limited distribution for certain products. But that doesn't necessarily limit access to patients, although if you talk to some of the bigger specialty pharmacies, they certainly want to imply that by not having them in the network, it could limit distribution or limit access to patients. But if you take a look at how payers react to that, payers really react to that specific to what is the right drug for the patient. And so you can certainly get that in-network approval regardless of what the distribution model is, if the product dictates that's required.
I think the biggest problem with REMS programs in the U.S. are for institutional patients. When we're talking REMS here, if you're an outpatient, you go into your local pharmacy, REMS can be managed very effectively. If it's a medication guide, if it's a communication issue, if it's any of those things that works real well. If you're in an IDN or a hospital situation, and I'm going to pick on you, and somebody, REMS program tells me that I have to deliver a certain amount of information and get patient, sign off to use an opioid in an institution, that just isn't going to happen. I mean, and that's an extreme example, but that was one of the examples they brought up during the hearings when they're talking about REMS and they're talking about the opioid analgesics and stuff like that. But if you're in an institution and you have to constantly reach out to 40 different vendors to get 40 different products because those products have been segregated into a distribution system only because of their REMS requirements, it makes it very difficult if you're a hospital pharmacist or you're in an institution to be able to do that logistically and maintain your J-code accreditation, all that other things by bringing in products from multiple vendors and stuff. So I think going forward, and I know the FDA is working on this as part of their initiatives, is to find out ways to standardize REMS programs or make it easier that REMS requirements that can be avoided are not applicable in certain practice settings. And if that becomes reality, then it will make it a little bit easier for the implementation of these things.
Yeah, whenever you talk about innovation, there's a couple of things that come to mind. The first is that sometimes the REMS can be a barrier to entry to certain companies, especially generics, because there's a substantial cost that's associated with the programs, and we're talking multi-million-dollar programs because of all of the data and all of the knowledge and just monitoring the program from a day-to-day basis, whether there's a call center or a website or whatever goes into the program. That can be very difficult for a lot of the smaller manufacturers, depending on how the costs are split up in some of the shared REMS. But then secondly, I think there is somewhat of an opportunity for manufacturers to go above and beyond what the REMS requires to really separate themselves as a manufacturer that's doing the responsible thing. I know at Mallinckrodt we've put a lot of effort into non-product specific education around responsible opioid prescribing and safe use, which we've done outside of the REMS restrictions, which has helped develop some great relationships for us.
I would say, I can't speak on behalf of manufacturers, but I would say it's definitely, from my perspective, stimulated some innovation. There's a lot of new programs that weren't available before, and 4 years into this now, or 5 years into this now, I think what we're seeing is this is just part of what it's going to take to get your drug to market now. And it's not only on behalf of manufacturers, but for the pharmacies that have to put programs in place to manage these, and the physician providers that have to put new programs in place. It's just becoming something that's inherent in what we do now in healthcare.
So go ahead.
I just wanted to make a point to what you said regarding somebody going above and beyond with the risk management program. I actually work for Jazz, and I work on the Xyrem program, actually, it's Fresh Scripts. So I think their company has actually gone above and beyond and done some special things that set them apart. And while sometimes it can be very tedious from the aspect of being a pharmacist, and we're the sole distributors, and we dispense from a cage, and we have that armed guard, and we do very, very tedious things while we're dispensing out of the cage. I think there's a lot of bonuses to that as well, coming from our pharmacist perspective, because when I have a patient that comes to me, I don't have to wonder, are they getting this from somewhere else? Are they possibly, doctor shopping or pharmacy shopping with this medication? I know for a fact that they're only getting it from us, that we're only distributing from our pharmacy. We have all of their records, we have all of their history, and I can feel comfortable in knowing that what I'm doing, if I'm following my, guidelines and my program guidelines, we're doing what's safe and effective for the patient. So all those things that they have done to go above and beyond are tedious, but I do appreciate them now in hindsight.
Well, that's worked okay for ortho Jazz, but and I don't know what they are now. But there are companies. I would just name a product or two, like on Solace, that absolutely killed that product.
Yeah.
A product is just tanked, and it tanked because of the REMS program that was attached to it. Nobody would, if you you spent the first half hour on the phone with somebody trying to get through to do something, you said, forget that, I'll just use something else. And literally there's an example of a REMS program that was set up to be responsible to the community and to meet all the guidelines, but it killed the commercial availability of the product, absolutely. So, you have to kind of balance that one with the other, but
And if you even take Xyrem as an example, though, if you take a look at when Xyrem went after their additional indication a year and a half or so ago, the FDA turned down that indication not because it didn't have good clinicals, but because they weren't confident that they could control a more open distribution model. And what was interesting about that, because I listened to that whole thing, because we had set up the distribution model to expand, was that if they would have ever asked the questions about the distribution model could have answered all the FDA questions, but the FDA made that determination without ever asking those questions.
You're right about the number of scripts. If you look at the number of scripts for just taking the terpenes for an example, the transmucosal fentanyl products, the number of scripts before and after the REMS went down substantially because whenever that program was implemented, it's a closed registry system where the pharmacists, the prescribers, the patients, the distributors, everyone has to be registered as part of the program. And for some people, it was just too big of a hassle to go through the education piece and signing off and then filling out the patient form. So in a way, it does restrict access for some programs.
So do you think that impacted patient care? Do you think that you also think it prevented distribution into the middle?
I think in some instances, yes, it did, because wholesalers are required to be sure that the pharmacy is registered before they can ship out the product. And so in some cases, there may have been delayed shipments for the pharmacies, and then for the patient, if they showed up at the pharmacy with a script and they weren't already enrolled in the program, they had to go through the whole hassle of contacting the prescriber, enrolling in the program, going through all of that mess. And so in some ways, I'm sure it did delay care.
keep in mind that for REMS programs, you have to look at REMS programs on the basis of the products that you're dispensing. If it's a acute care product, something needs to go out like that, treat patients, and you have a REMS program, that's just a recipe for disaster. Because unless it's been predetermined, otherwise somebody was going into surgery and you could do all this anything happening so you could have it at the end. It just not work for acute care or a product like that. So what will end up happening is doctors will just avoid the hassle because there just isn't time to do the kinds of things they have to do to get the product into patient hands and then go through a distribution system where it can be in your local pharmacy here at Walgreens or wherever it has to come from, Medco or Caremark or wherever it is all over the United States. It has to get there to you to some degree. So in some ways it works well, and it's designed to help things, but then on the flip side it can be disastrous, just absolutely disastrous. And we've launched a number of products where we've been able to avoid that problem just by negotiating very closely with the FDA and changing the distribution system, just tweaking it a little bit so that they don't feel like there's this massive amount of people who just access the product and get it from it.
One of the potential barriers for care is really on the physician side. We hear a lot from physicians, a lot of pushback around, look, there is no continuity here. Every program is different. The enrollment process is different. The education piece is different. The way I have to now treat my patient is different. And without question, there are physicians that have chosen not to prescribe some of these drugs simply because they didn't want to participate in a REMS program. So there is some impact to patient care.
So, with my teaching experience in clinical epidemiology and evidence-based medicine, one of the things, I view the REMS program as an intervention. And when you study an intervention, you want to measure the impact of that, and you can do that in a variety of ways. But from your perspective, what has the impact been on patient care, actual clinical impact? Have we reduced the risk, and is there any data that that's maybe not data on file as required by the manufacturers, but are there studies that really look at the impact of REMS?
That's the million-dollar question, right? That's probably what everybody here would
That's why
like
I
to
asked
know. And I would tell you, I don't know that I know that answer. I actually did a little research before coming here tonight to see if I could answer that question. And I think on the pros side, if the REMS program is working the way it's designed, There is interaction between the physician and the patient, interaction between the pharmacist and the patient. We are hopefully mitigating some risk, and that should be good for the patient. On the other hand, we know that there are some barriers, some administrative difficulties. And Mike referenced a little while ago, I think I heard you referenced the study. The OIG earlier this year issued a public report where they had gone back and looked at some REMS programs and looked at, for example, 32 particular REMS programs and found that only one, and the FDA followed up on only one of them in terms of looking at outcomes toward the end of that. So with every REMS program, manufacturers required to document outcomes and side effects and whole litany of things that they need to do. And the FDA has the authority to require these programs rather than going back and determining has it been successful or not. And I think we're not there yet. When you talk about where we're going to see in the future, I have to believe that we're going to see the FDA doing more to follow up so that we can have some kind of outcomes data to tell us whether we think this is good or it really is having a positive impact on the patient.
Yeah, so hypothetically, if you think about it, if a patient is getting more attention because of the REMS program, so they're having a nurse case manager that's following up, they're having a pharmacist that's following up, and they're having more interventions with a clinical professional that is helping them with the drug, their side effects, their lifestyle, and the various aspects of that disease state, then in theory, a REMS program should help a patient, and that's what it was designed to do. Now, we can certainly argue that program products that are not readily available or that take longer to get access to and things of that nature might have some limited impact on not being able to provide immediate access or immediate clinical value to a patient because it takes a day or two or a week to get that product on the patient on the product. But over time, in theory, you think that if the patient is getting more attention from the right level of clinical professional, that they would be receiving a better level of care.
I think that is a great question. It's one that many people would love the answer to. I think that as far as the challenges of REMS are concerned, that's probably the biggest one that I can see is you're going through all of these process steps, but is it really effective? And I can give an example with the extended release and long-acting opioid REMS. As part of the goals, sometimes you're just measuring the process and not the outcomes. So as part of the goals there, they're trying to educate 25% of active opioid prescribers within the first 2 years of the CME education being made available. So you're educating the prescribers, but you really have no knowledge on whether you're impacting patient outcomes or really reducing either addiction, overdose, and death. So it's just, there's not necessarily a good way of doing it. I know a lot of people are looking at that. We're talking about doing pre-surveys and post-surveys, like knowledge, attitude, and behavior surveys for prescribers, and then also doing surveys for patients as part of this program to see if there's limited access in any way. So I think that there's attempts being made, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question.
John.
I have a question about the REMS programs as it relates to the FDA's resources. And, industry has to pay the average record review. Once a REMS program is put in place, that should only have to be once a REMS program is put in place, do they establish a fee then for the REMS program? And that usually that means that it's staffed from the FDA standpoint to back in question to review the things they're supposed to be looking for, because that's essentially what the use of the act does. Is it gives them resources to do what they're supposed to do.
There are still costs associated with that, and that's actually another one of the issues. So looking at PDUFA and GDUFA, which is the prescription drug user fee and the generic drug user fees, that's an issue right now with the shared REMS, because right now with the shared REMS, you have a class of companies and you have a class of drugs that are all part of one program. And there's a gold standard template document that everyone is supposed to go off of. And if there's a single change to that document, whether there's a new product that's added, a new company joins the group, the generic companies as part of the GDUFA have to pay about $30,000 each time just for one small change in the document to get that reviewed by FDA. So, and that's for the generic companies, not for the branded, just because of the differences between PDUFA and GDUFA and the regulatory things that are part of that. So that's one issue that doesn't seem quite fair for the generic companies right now. And I know that right now the FDA is looking at a shared drug master file program where they would just have one set of documents instead of each company submitting all of the changes every time one little thing changes, just having one per shared REMS. I think that that would be really helpful in the long run, and I know that that's something the FDA is trying with a certain number of programs to see if that'll work in the end. But there are still a lot of fees that are associated with the ongoing management of REMS.
So we've talked about the impact of REMS from a variety of perspectives, and that was really intentional. We addressed the issue of patients really from their perspective, how was that? And we've touched on the issue of burden from pharmacy and then maybe the workflow. But can anybody elaborate and expound a little on the impact in either on the community pharmacy side or the hospital pharmacy side of these REMS?
I'll join. From being a retail pharmacist owning a specialty pharmacy, I can tell you that we've killed more trees now since REMS were available than before. I mean, I think there's the question before that was kind of a good one about, are we making an impact? I think there was a period there in pharmacy when products were being approved so fast by the FDA that pharmacists weren't keeping up, granted, with all the technical information required. So there probably was a lapse in the amount of information that was provided to a patient or the counseling to a patient. And now that pendulum has swung totally to the other side, where now we're just deluging patients with all kinds of stuff. But are they really reading it? Do they really understand it? And I think we're to the point now where we need, from a retail perspective, the things have to be. You just can't give somebody to read. You still have to put it into perspective. And I think the pharmacists of any of the providers, whether it's physicians or nurses or whatever, are in a unique position to put drug use in perspective. Granted, there are risks with everything you take, but to be able to put it in the perspective of this is really why you're taking it. You potentially could be taking a risk, but these are the benefits. Let's talk about what can be done. I think that's the good part. Once again, I think that all the other stuff that goes downstream with it, once you get into the institution, long-term care, it's an absolute disaster. Anybody in long-term care here? I mean, it is an absolute, when you're dealing with, Alzheimer's patients, you're dealing with dementia patients, how are you going to do a REMS program with them? I could get them to sign over their entire estate. That's great, but, so I mean, there are issues once you get into the institution. And on the hospital side, I've been a member of ASHP for a long time, and I'm on one of their committees for the REM stuff, and they talk all the time about the difficulties. I hear examples all the time about how an institution is very difficult to obtain a product, get it into their institution, and meet their JCO, accreditation, and all the other things that go with it. So I think there's a lot of problems that still need to be fixed with these, especially with some of the higher touch stuff. That eventually maybe it'll work it all itself out, but I think it's still going to take some time to do that. And granted, patient education is great, but in a acute setting, once again, it just can't be done very, very effectively in an acute situation.
I would say in a pharmacy setting, it's maybe twofold, right? I mean, you have education. So even if you're in retail pharmacy, I think 75% of these REMS programs are no more requirement other than a med guide. So if you're in a retail pharmacy and your only real requirement is to hand somebody a med guide, even if that's all you're going to do, you still need to train your staff on what the program is and where the med guide is located, and are you going to print it with every prescription from your software system, or are you going to go on the internet and print one every time you fill, or are you going to grab the one that comes with the stock bottle? And hopefully you go a step beyond that, and you're doing more than just sticking the med guide in the sack, but you are engaging that patient in the dialogue that it's intended. So from a retail perspective, you still have some administrative headache where you have to get your staff engaged. You take that a step deeper and you get into some of the other products with the elements to ensure safe use, the programs become much more complicated, and you're really looking at putting a protocol in place for each and every drug, all a little bit different. So how do I manage this? Who's going to manage it? And follow it all the way through from the time the physician enrolls the patient, maybe in a registry. Make sure the physician's enrolled, you have documentation of that. I'm thinking of Revlimid right now is an oncology drug. When the physician has to be enrolled, they get an authorization number, it's got to come to you on the prescription. You have to validate that, it's only good for 7 days when the patient, if it's a female, last pregnancy test. You then do the counseling of the patient, you have to get a confirmation number then from Celgene before you dispense, and when you get the confirmation number, you have 24 hours to dispense the drug. There's a lot of processes there where you have to have a program and an educated staff to be able to manage all of that.
And then to keep in mind, I just want to add, then you overlay, that's just the REMS program. Yet we've never talked about the payer aspect of it. In other words, if you overlay the payer aspect of it, the REMS program is telling you have to do this in this time frame, and this in this time frame, and this is this time frame. All that would take would be a prior auth or something to blip into the middle of that, and you're dead. The process is killed. You have to start over. Everybody has to rearrange what they're doing. I mean, it's once again, you have misaligned incentives. So you have the pharmacy stuff, which is aligned, but then you have the payer stuff, which is now aligned to the whole thing. So and Kevin, you of all people can talk to the payer stuff on that.
One of the things I'd like to do is, anybody have a card with a question that you'd like to ask? I know we've asked some, and that's definitely appropriate, but I just want to make sure we give you opportunity now to send it up the aisle, and Stephanie will come around. So, yeah, or if you just want to ask, that's certainly fine.
I have a question about the long-acting opioids program. So I don't envy you having worked at the FDA on that one, because it seems like the result, what you got, there's nothing, there's no teeth in it at all. There's nothing anyone has to really comply with. So, how can I measure any results of that besides survey? It just seems completely like a waste of time for a lot of people and a waste of money. My concern is, if you can shed some light on this, the same thing happened with myofenolate. There's a REMS for that program, and that's completely useless from my perspective also. So they're going to make this worse. We're going to see that there's really not anything happening with the long-acting opioids. Are we going to be seeing something more restrictive and really, especially in an institution like you mentioned, hospitals setting up these REMS programs in a large institution is a nightmare. And I'm just really worried about this opioid thing.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there's so many different pieces that are involved in that. For one, there's interagency collaboration. So the FDA is just one organization, and some people have called for the continuing medical education piece of that REMS to be mandatory for prescribers rather than voluntary like it is now. But to have that component, you would have to get the DEA to collaborate with the FDA. And whenever people go to renew their DEA licenses or apply for a DEA license to show proof that they've completed the education, would require both of those agencies to collaborate. The second piece, you have a lot of the big medical associations like AMA, the American Academy of Family Physicians, coming out strongly opposed to this education becoming mandatory because they don't feel that their physicians should have to be made to complete this training. And so there's a lot of infighting there. I can tell you right now, the way the goals are looking, I think that there probably will be changes in that REMS program later on down the road, and I would not be at all surprised if the training became mandatory at some point. But as far as there being restrictions from the distribution standpoint of being a closed registry or anything like that, I don't necessarily see that happening anytime soon.
I think the flip side of this is this: if you're how many pharmacists here to be are in the room? Literally, you could get to the point in 3 years where if you're going to go to work for a pharmacy, they're going to ask you on how many programs have you already certified to dispense. In other words, if you're going to go to work for Avella, maybe they're going to ask you, instead of waiting 6 months to get you trained on all the individual programs, so you're in the REMS program, as a provider. Having or being a provider in certain programs might make you more marketable to other people out there. It's an interesting way of looking at it, but if you look at what's going on, more and more drugs are requiring a pharmacist, a physician, whoever the providers are, to be educated and certified on a product. Pretty soon, pharmacy school will just be the starting point for what you have to do And then all the other things that you do when you drop into a pharmacy is now I'm going to have to, for instance, I can just give you an example. In the cystic fibrosis world, you'd have to jump in and say, okay, I'm certified to do Kalydeco Vertex, gene-based product, and now I'm certified to do Hasten and the Altera, the delivery. I mean, you have to literally be certified in 15 different drugs just to be able to deliver pharmacy services, which right now you just do it because you've gone to pharmacy school, you're licensed as a pharmacist. So it has, I think these things have implications much bigger than what we're thinking about, but it could add some value to pharmacists, going forward as a resident.
It's actually a good point. I mean, today, most of these REMS programs certify the facility, right, the pharmacy provider practice. I have heard discussion around certification of the pharmacist as opposed to the pharmacy, and what does that mean to the profession? And to Mike's point, maybe that makes pharmacists more marketable in some respects.
Good. Kevin, I wonder if you'd be able to elaborate when we got a question here about, Mike had touched on the payer perspective and really the workflow, and is there anything else that you can add as far as the process of payer and how it's affecting that?
Well, just to be clear, I don't work for a payer, but I do work with them in terms of managed care contracting. And I guess from my perspective today, you guys may disagree, the impact of the payer is going to be a little bit less because it's really the manufacturer that's responsible for creating these programs. That said, I think it's fairly common that the payers would look at the REMS requirements and the specific indications for drug and use that information in formulary decisions. They're determining whether to pay or not, partially based on maybe some of the information in that REMS. But I'll also tell you that I've also heard some discussion in AMCP around should payers insert themselves a little more into the REMS space, and should they be a gatekeeper for these programs? Since they're paying for drug and claims are adjudicated through them, should they be the ones making the determination whether it's appropriate for the patient to have this by determining whether all the requirements have been met? So that could be something that we see.
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting question, and it really varies payer by payer. So I'll give you a very real-world example. We're working with a product for medullary thyroid cancer. There's two products in the category that actually have approval for that indication. One has a REMS program, a risk mitigation program, and one does not. One has a black box. One has a black box, but not quite as bad. When you go to the payers, for the most part, the payers have said, we really don't care about the REMS program. Yeah, that's the doctor's problem to deal with. So we'll make the decision as to how we cover the product, and we'll let the physician worry about the REMS program. Now, if in some cases they might believe that it restricts access to the point where it takes a day to get the patient one drug and a week to get the second drug, then that might vary their decision. But all other things being equal, the feedback that we've gotten to a large degree is we're going to let the physician worry about that, we're not going to worry about it.
So maybe the last question before we wrap up, and this will require you to maybe use a crystal ball and project into the future, but we've seen evolution of these programs in the past, and we're now talking about a new way of evaluating them and developing them. And how do you see REMS developing over the next 1 to 3 to 5 years in the future?
Well, I can start. First of all, I think they're not going to go away. I think we're going to see more. There's more and more new specialty drugs that come into the marketplace, and a certain percentage of them are going to have REMS programs affiliated with those. And we will see change. I think there's a lot of interest in some form of, not regulation, but conformity to what these programs look like. I know that NCPP as an organization has a task group right now that's looking at standardization in the claims transaction to be able to adjudicate REMS requirement information in your pharmacy claims. I think we'll see that maybe within the next 2 or 3 years. So it will continue to evolve. Definitely not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, so if you take a look at the FDA pipeline in today's world, there's over 500 drugs that are in the FDA pipeline that are designated as orphan drugs. So what does that mean? Well, other than it's very high likelihood that a significant amount of those, call it 1%, call it 10%, are going to have some sort of a REMS program. But I think what we're going to see not only is the fact we're going to have more REMS program, but technology is going to be much more involved in REMS programs. So when you reach into your magic pocket, and we heard that 2 seconds ago, I'll pick on that for a second. We all have these little things called phones, and most of us have smartphones, right? So there's a diabetic company out there today, in many forms and fashions, but one in particularly that got an approval as a 510K to do diabetic management as a medical device. Okay? So what happens when the FDA starts to require manufacturers to work with companies like that, technology companies, to say, look, we want to be able to track in real time what patients are, their side effects, this, that, their blood level, whatever it might be, right? And they start using technology to drive that, and it's just logical to think that technology is going to have a big impact on how REMS is going to be managed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, with the electronic health records and e-prescribing, it just seems like technology is becoming a bigger piece. And so I think that eventually REMS are going to have to become a part of that workflow to make it a little bit easier. I think from the FDA, we're going to see two things. I think we're going to see guidance on standardization between the REMS programs, and then I think we're also going to see guidance on modifications to the REMS documents, which would be really welcome to the manufacturers who are trying to collaborate together. I also think, I've heard a lot about a REMS portal, the idea of just one website that would house several different pieces of information where you could go there to look at the information you need per product, possibly enroll patients as a one-stop shop. I think that that's pretty, pie in the sky. I think that that would take a long time to get to that point, but I hope to eventually see us there.
I heard the same company that's developing the ACA portal is working on that too.
So we should have it 10 years.
But it won't work then.
Yeah.
I agree with all my colleagues here. I think that technology is going to add significant advantage to what's going on. I think electronic health records are big. But I think the thing that where REMS is going to take sort of a divergent path is when you look at the individual diseases. When Dean had mentioned the number of orphan drug applications that are out there. Orphan drugs are always going to be dealt with differently, and having a distribution system and a REMS program around something that's very sophisticated, very small populations is very appropriate. But when you start looking at the big diseases, the asthma, the diabetes, the hypertension, stuff like that, it's going to require a lot of different thinking, because to do a REMS program for something that costs $200,000 a year, no biggie for a manufacturer, but doing a REMS program for 5 million patients when you're paying, when the drug's only costing $1,200 to $1,500 a year is a little bit different story. So I think you're going to see some differences there just between the types of drugs and how they work out. And I think where the FDA wants to eventually go with all this stuff is, I think this is all going to kind of morph into, with the electronic health records, et cetera, into some kind of comparative efficacy. They're going to start looking at, if we're doing a REMS program, especially in a category where there's multiple products, we just don't want to look at that individual product, we want to look at the other ones too. So comparative effectiveness research, I think that's kind of where, if I had to predict in 5 years where they want to go, that's kind of where you want to go. Because at the end of the day, you definitely want to say, okay, if this was the better product, and it's because we collected all this data and it's better safety profile, better efficacy, whatever, then that's the one we want to put our money behind. I think that's kind of where the healthcare system needs to go.
That's great. Well, one last opportunity for any questions from the audience.
I would just add one thing, because I think I'm imagining myself in the audience. I know whenever I heard about REMS, I thought, oh my gosh, there's so many. How would I ever get to know all of these? And how would I know what's required of me? There are a lot of resources out there that you can find out exactly what products do require a REMS. If you go to FDA.gov and search REMS, there's a full listing of exactly the individual REMS as well as the 6 shared REMS classes. And a lot of the shared REMS classes have their own websites where they have FAQs and a full description of what the product requires. So if you have any questions about a specific drug, I would just recommend going on one of those websites.
That's excellent. Well, I know for me, REM, the acronym stood for Rapid Eye Movement. It was associated with sleep, and I know we're getting closer to that time now. So I want to thank our panelists, and what you brought was a tremendous tremendous amount of expertise, a tremendous amount of experience and personal focus. And so that you can't pay for that, and this was free. And so we really do appreciate that, and we appreciate your contributions to St. Louis County Pharmacy and through this alumni, and it's really a neat thing. So thank you again for everybody attending. We hope you have a safe trip home, and feel free to stay around after a while. Talk to the panelists if you want to come up. The building will be open for a little while longer, and you can feel free to chat with anybody from the college. Thank you very much.